Okay, yay. We're getting set up and getting in here. It used to ring the doorbell. I think I took off the sound so it would when it clicks in, it would ring a doorbell like ding, you're in your own house. And it doesn't do that anymore. It's lost a little luster. I got to figure out what I did there.
Right on.
Yeah, sad times. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's Eat and Greet. Hopefully, in the next hour or so, we give you something that is worth the time you took to come and sit and spend some time with us. So I'm really glad to have you guys here. It is a busy day on the Eat and Greets. We're talking about a lot today. Apparently, as the temperatures start to change, we change season. It gets social around here, very Libra-esque. I like that business. So today, we are going to talk about mystical Saturn. I love that. What a way to frame Saturn, because that is not how we normally are approached with the Saturnian energy. So we've got our tour guide Acyuta-Bava with us today. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Stormie. Thanks for having me. This is going to be fun.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, and it's so great because as we were going through and kind of figuring out topics, this just came really easily out. So I think it must be something that, the collective want to/need to hear about. So we're going to jam about that today.
Yeah, it's a good time because we've got this big stellium of planets in Capricorn, Saturn sign, and then we've got Jupiter and Saturn moving into Aquarius in December, again, Saturn sign. So there's a lot of Saturn energy in the astrological sky right now, and it really helps to understand some of the misconceptions about Saturn and some of the history of Saturn, because as we titled this talk, I mean, it turns out that Saturn is just this really mystical planet that people often really kind of unfortunately misunderstand.
Yeah. Well, and it's nice because I think a lot of what's been happening, at least around this channel this year, has been a lot of debunking, demystifying the planets and getting a new relationship with them, which I think is so in alignment with where we're going forward. And even now, as we look at the nodes being in Gemini and Sag, it's getting a new relationship with information left and right, I feel like, So I love that we're going to have this conversation and see the perspective that you have to offer so that we can re-engage Saturn in transit in our charts and kind of how those energies are moving. Because I will say, I don't care how we reframe Saturn. Saturn is not really interested in whether or not you are interested in advancing. He's like, yes, well, I would love to walk with you and we can grow together and it'll be beautiful. I am as equally willing to drag you if you're not, and that just kind of is what it is. So it's like, well, let's find the way to cushion that embrace and see what the conversation's really about. So
yeah, absolutely. Great point too about the nodes changing signs and kind of reframing thoughts and ideas and learning. Yeah, it's totally in the air right now. Good call.
Yeah, well, and then we move into Aquarius, all in the air, right? Like, whoa, okay, we're gonna definitely get some new ideas around this place. So I'm gonna let you take the reins for a minute, and I'm gonna welcome and say hi to everybody in the chat.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you. I'm going to put, I have a PDF that I made because I've really been passionate about this topic. And I started with a very small group of astrologers over the summer giving a little talk on this. And then when we were talking, I was like, you know what, this is going to be great to bring it to a bigger audience and maybe circulate these ideas a little bit more, but let's make it look good. So I'm going to try to put this up on the screen, and maybe Stormie, you could just tell me if it's showing up all right.
Yeah, looks good and mystical in and of itself, which is perfect. And I love, thank you for putting your website up there just right away so people can dig in and come by and see you.
Totally. I can mention other ways that people can stay connected maybe at the end.
Beautiful.
But yeah, so we're gonna, this is kind of a baptism by fire. We'll go through a lot of things about Saturn. Hopefully we'll go through them quickly and leave some room for conversation as we go. But we're going to talk about some of the modern significations of Saturn. So what are the typical things that people think about Saturn? If every day, if you ask someone about Saturn, what are they likely to say? Then we're going to talk about Saturn and the relationship that Saturn often has to the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and how Saturn's meaning in the modern era of astrology has been framed in large part in relation to these more newly discovered planets. And that's a really key piece of understanding Saturn now, but also an important piece of how we're going to get into understanding the traditional significations of Saturn and how they've changed over time. Then we're going to talk about finally what's called the joy of Saturn, which was traditionally the 12th house. And then we are also going to talk a little bit about the discovery chart of Neptune and what that has in common with Saturn. So that's kind of the map of where we're going.
Nice.
Does that make enough sense so far?
Yeah, absolutely. Plus, I'm just like, I'm learning to PowerPoint a lot more extreme. So I'm like looking at everybody's graphics like crazy.
Okay, cool. So you just pause me if there's questions that are meaningful or you want to cut in and just ask something or say something. I'll try to clip through this at a good rate otherwise.
Absolutely. And you guys, if you have questions, as always, I'm here in the chat and I will facilitate that between what we've got going on here.
Okay, cool. So in modern astrology, the basic meaning of Saturn has changed compared to what it was thousands of years ago. And there's some good and there's some bad in that. But as a result, we tend to only emphasize certain aspects of Saturn's symbolism, and we've lost touch with some of the more diverse significations of Saturn. So that's kind of the main point of today's talk. In modern astrology, some of the most common significations of Saturn that you'll hear go like this. Saturn is going to be associated with time and karma, with hard work. That's a pretty basic one you'll hear a lot of people. Or the teacher, but specifically kind of teacher as taskmaster, which I thought this pictured. This is like, yeah, if you could picture Saturn as a teacher, that's him right there.
Right. Yeah. Like he is not caring. He's like, write
Yep.
the thing down.
And he has a little stick too. He could hit you with that little stick. Discipline and structure. We hear that one a lot, as well as restriction, constraint, and limitation. You also hear Saturn associated with conservatism, whether that's political or just an attitude toward life. It doesn't have to be political, but just conservative energy in general. A resistance to change, and the old order, kind of like old fashioned or old traditional things. So none of these are wrong. All of these do in fact have something to do with Saturn, but it's not the whole story. We also have authority and authoritarianism, very Saturn-like. Yeah. And you can also add in responsibility and maturity. So these are the basic themes. And again, these are all appropriate for Saturn, but they just don't tell the full story. So everyone should feel pretty comfortable and familiar with those. Is there any really stereotyped significations of Saturn that you can think of, Stormie, that didn't make that list?
I don't think so. I think those are the common ones. And it's just kind of, I feel like it comes with phrases like, oh my God.
Right. Yeah.
Quite totally. Often,
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk now about Saturn and the outer planets. So modern astrologers, when the outer planets were first being discovered, we have to remember what was happening historically. This is like late 1800s, early 1900s, when modern astrologers were really starting to pay more attention to the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and of course into the 1900s with Pluto as well. But modern astrologers tended to initially at least glorify the outer planets as indication of a more evolved or sophisticated astrology. Hey, there's new planets. It must mean that astrology is getting like an upgrade. And they tended to pit the newly discovered outer planets against the traditional planets, the traditional 7 planets, and Saturn especially. It was as though Saturn came to represent everything that was old in astrology itself, and the outer planets, who were called trans-Saturnian as well as transpersonal, became these symbols that sort of were supposed to take us beyond the old way. And the old way of astrology sort of became associated with Saturn itself. And that's not endogenous to Saturn. Like that's kind of something that was put on Saturn. So we're going to try to take that off a little bit. Okay, so for example, I'm going to read you guys some quotes and give you just to kind of prove my point here. So an early modern astrologer named Raymond Harrison, and I believe this was probably around the turn of the last century, wrote, "To those who can respond to their very high vibrations, Uranus and Neptune, and probably Pluto, denote the more highly cultivated types of humanity." So this is at a time in history where, theosophy and a migration of Eastern philosophy into the West is taking place, romanticism in the literary history, like it's the Romantic movement, and it's definitely a time where we're also on the brink of industrial, technological, and scientific enlightenment and revolution in the West, especially. And there's this sense of progress, 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 the future, the future, the future. And with that comes this idea that the outer planets also may represent a more evolved or sophisticated human being or consciousness or potential in human beings in general. This is at the brink of what was called the human potential movement, which we now sometimes also call the New Age movement. And so the initial take on the outer planets before any research had really even been done is, hey, they must represent higher vibrations, more highly cultivated types of humanity and things like that. Now, that's not neither here nor there. I'm not going to say that they aren't, but it's interesting how that ends up. This particular idea about the outer planets starts being used in relation to Saturn. He also wrote, it has been suggested that both Uranus and Neptune are the spiritual correspondents or counterparts of Mercury and Venus. They probably are in touch with elements of thought and feeling that are wholly inconceivable to the more mundane types of Venus and Mercury. So you can also see this thing that starts happening, which is that modern astrologers start saying that the outer planets are basically higher and more sophisticated octaves or versions of the traditional planets. And remember that they're not doing this with any great research. There's not even really any experimentation that they're calling on or any charts that they're using. This is, in a sense, purely theoretical speculation and philosophical speculation. And again, it's not to say that it's wrong, but it is, it also, we have to remember that the astrologers that were making these claims were also not at all in touch with the ancient tradition. And we're going to explain why that is and why they weren't in touch with the ancient tradition in a minute. But so there's another article from the Astrologers magazine in 1891 that stated, what our forefathers as astrologers lacked in deficient astronomical knowledge, through which much of what they said was regarded through a superstitious eye only, is more than replaced in modern times by advanced scientific knowledge. So there's this other theme that's really important to understand, which is that early modern astrologers basically thought that ancient astrologers were sort of antiquated, superstitious people, and that modern astrology was de facto more advanced because science had become more advanced. And this is also a part of a movement to try to make astrology into a science, like an empirical science, just as well regarded as physics. And this is problematic for a variety of reasons. We'll kind of speak to that as we go along. Alan Leo, who's arguably one of the godfathers of modern astrology, also wrote that the ancients would frequently attribute partial effects to fallacious causes, hence the theory of terms and phases, which the experience of the present day lead us to reject. Substitutes were used to supply the place of the mystic planet Uranus in horary astrology. The old traditions were either lost or had become so corrupted and distorted that astrology could no longer be called a science, but rather a mere mode of divination. So here's another prejudice that early modern astrologers had, which is that they really believed that ancient astrology was unscientific, and they thought that divination itself, as you can see in this quote, is lesser than science. And remember, they're really trying to appeal to the modern scientific mindset. So this is complicated because we have Saturn and the old planets, the traditional 7 planets, so-called, being compared to the outer planets through the lens of this progressivism. And that progressivism was not in touch with the bulk of the historical and theoretical tradition, because that textual tradition was in Greek and not yet available in the English language. So you have people who are making a lot of assumptions about what ancient astrologers believed and did in practice and what ancient astrology was, in contrast to the modern astrology that was being developed. For example, Leo also wrote that the Greeks held to the tradition of the Chaldeans for a time, but the study gradually became more of an art than a science with them, and it's so far degenerated in its teachings that little trace of the original truths can be found in the Greek authors known to us, finally becoming nothing more than a form of divination. So again, you can see how much he dislikes divination. And this is important because most of us, for example, that probably most of us, I'm guessing, who like astrology would have no problem with divination now. We do tarot, the tarot cards or angel cards or some other form of divination, and we don't have a problem with that. But early modern astrologers did. They wanted astrology to be something superior to divination. It was very clear to them that divination was not going to cut it for the modern scientific mind. But ancient astrology was divination. So this is, starting to see the underlying prejudices and differences that start to inform how people are going to think about the traditional planets and especially Saturn. So in modern astrology, Saturn was thus seen as the place-holding symbol for the categorical difference between the merely mundane traditional 7 planets, which were associated with this old superstitious divination, and the more highly evolved outer planets in a more highly evolved scientific modern era. So Saturn in relation to the outer planets thus represents the limits of an old system, the merely mundane or personal, a less evolved archaic past, the stubbornness of an old worldview, a less evolved planet representing an old and less evolved form of astrology. And it's really interesting that Saturn actually has never in the history of astrology represented anything quite like that. There are some interesting associations, for example, with limitations, with for example, with tradition and things like that. But Saturn had this very deep and rich mystical meaning that was, in my mind, if you really learn about it, you'll find out that it is just as mystical and transcendental and otherworldly as any of the outer planets, as were all of the ancient traditional planets. So, okay, we're moving along at a good clip, but before I go into talking about the traditional significations of Saturn now and how they kind of contrast to the modern, do we have any questions at this point, Stormie?
Nope, so far so good. So I think we can keep trekking.
Okay, awesome. Good, because there's a bunch to get through now when we start talking about what Saturn actually meant. So by contrast, Saturn's symbolism in ancient astrology was really, really diverse. Saturn was associated maybe primarily, the thing that can help you understand Saturn as a very diverse symbol most intimately is its association with melancholy. So Saturn was associated with melancholy, and melancholy itself is this diverse temperament, behavior, human experience that oftentimes some people have more than others, especially if you have a strong Saturn in your chart. And so any of the following themes or qualities can be associated with melancholy and Saturn: depression, wistful longing, meaning there's almost like a divine discontent with Saturn. You look at the world as if you're 20,000 feet up. You have this big, vast, expansive view of it, but there's a remoteness or a distance, but it creates oftentimes within a kind of romantic longing quality. Severe emotions, whether good or bad, were associated with Saturn. So if it's extreme elation alternating to, say, extreme anxiety or extreme fear or extreme frustration, but severe emotions in general were associated with melancholy and with Saturn. Grief was associated with Saturn. So when you think about Saturn, you're thinking about, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but you're thinking about a planet that was associated with winter, and winter with loss and death and grief. Hallucinations and delusions were associated with Saturn. Saturn was related to things like nightmares and ominous dreams and figures and anything that may come as a distortion of reality, especially in sleep. Dark or somber reveries, if you've ever heard the Moonlight Sonata, I think it's Beethoven, or Mozart's Requiem. These are Saturnine qualities. Insomnia, the inability to sleep, is associated with Saturn and melancholy. Demonic possession, if you want to get really dark, dark evil spirits. In fact, the house that Saturn was associated with, the 12th house, was called Malas Daemon, which meant evil spirit. And we'll talk more about the 12th house later and Saturn's association with the 12th house. But the idea of there being dark or negative energies or influences that you contend with or that can take over, but that you may struggle with, that's associated with melancholy and with Saturn. So the darkness is there with Saturn, but the thing is that these qualities for ancient mystics were incredibly important to to a spiritual life, to a reflective and psychologically meaningful life. Saturn was associated with winter, death, old age, and impermanence. And impermanence might be one of the most important, both in the Indian cosmology and in the ancient Western esotericism. For example, the Pythagoreans, the Platonists, the Hermeticists. Impermanence is the beginning of spiritual life. Once you understand that your body will die someday, that you may have like an indwelling spirit soul that goes on, but that the form you're in won't last. That's a Saturnine realization. And it's the realization that begins the journey for the Buddha, right? Siddhartha goes outside of the city walls or the palace walls. He's a young prince who lives in opulence, and he sees poverty, he sees death in the streets. And this hard, cold reality of impermanence becomes the beginning, the foundation of spiritual life. And for ancient, astrologers, Saturn, you have to remember that Saturn is this very dim, distant planet. It's the dimmest and most distant, farthest out of the planets. And it ruled the sign of Capricorn, which was called the gateway of the gods. And at the gateway of the gods, you are at the darkest point of the solar year in the symbolism of the zodiac in the northern hemisphere, where the zodiac is created. And from that point forward, the light starts to return. And the opposite sign of Cancer was called the gateway of man. And it was a place of incarnation. Cancer was thought of as the place where the soul enters the body, which is why it's ruled by the moon, as the moon is a reflective light. So it's not an original light, it's a reflective light. And what is incarnation of the spirit soul into the body? It's consciousness starting to reflect itself in a form. So the moon was associated with incarnation into this realm of forms. Capricorn and Saturn was associated with death and the transmigration of the soul out of the body again, back to the realm of the gods or the stars. So Capricorn had a very mystical meaning in association with the departure, the transmigration of the soul in death. But see, that's not just that signification is not just death in a morbid way. It's death in a very mystical sense, that you're a spirit soul, your life continues onward, which is why, although it's the darkest point, and we're talking about it as the point of exodus of the soul from the body, it's also the return of the light, which means that the soul goes on. So Saturn had this association with not just death and endings in a brutal, sad, horrible sense, but also in the sense of eternity. Saturn was the dimmest and most distant planet, closest to the realm of the fixed stars and the divine primary motion or prime mover, generative, divine sort of Godhead that was thought to be beyond the fixed stars. And you can see this mirrored in Dante's Paradiso. All the medieval writers were so in touch with this. Dante's Paradiso has Saturn as the seventh realm of heaven, where Saturn rules the seventh realm of heaven, where Dante encounters the spirits of people who had devoted their lives to quiet, reclusive prayer and contemplation. So if you think of the Hermit card in tarot, you're thinking about Saturn as a person who's in their cave or in their study or up in the mountains in the wintry cabin, next to a fire, in contemplation and prayer and reflection upon vast, distant things. So Saturn is also, as the dimmest and most distant planet, was associated with the contemplation, the contemplative life of prayer that mystics, monks, people like that, nuns had. And so Saturn has this very intimate relationship, not only with impermanence and death and winter and decay, but also with the distance needed to contemplate vaster realities. Saturn was associated with dark weather and trades by cold, wet places. It has a really intimate association with stormy weather, and also like the ocean and colder, darker waters like streams running underground, or a river at nighttime. It has that sense of the darker waters, not so much the the sunshine, next to the ocean, or the sunshine next to the river, but a darker, moodier, broodier, watery quality. Saturn was also associated with deterioration and dampness, though because later in the tradition, Saturn gets associated with the combination of dryness and coldness, which, by the way, is associated with melancholy in the ancient tradition.
Yeah, I was thinking about the medical reference to that too.
Yeah.
Astrology.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's really important to add in dampness, because if you find mold growing in your basement and it's cold and damp, like that's also a Saturnine thing. So that kind of cold, damp, watery quality is just so that people don't always think of Saturn as just dry and rigid. That's really important. Now, Saturn was exalted traditionally in the sign of the fall equinox, Libra, the sign of the harvest, which was a sign of justice and judgment, as well as beauty and fairness. So one thing that's really interesting about Saturn is to look at its exaltation sign. Here's the sign of Venus that's associated with beauty. And you have to remember that ancient Greeks thought that beauty, truth, and justice, fairness, or harmony were all non-different from one another. So that if anything that's truly beautiful should be also hold some sense of truth to it. Like if you've ever looked at a shell on the beach, it's so beautiful, but it's also like perfectly designed. It's like perfectly symmetrical. So Saturn has this affiliation with the perfect justice, balance, judgment, beauty of nature and of the universe itself, as well as Saturn is, in this sense, Saturn is associated with karma, because Libra is the sign of the harvest, where we reap what we sow, and the scales of justice. Well, if you think about the Egyptian Hall of Mot, for example, you have the heart being weighed against the feather in the underworld, and that sense of divine justice, that is Saturn, but it's not. Sometimes people think of it as punitive, and it's not. Saturn is not reflective of a punitive universe. We can experience justice as punitive to the extent that our souls are not trained and we're not living a reflective and contemplative life. That's how ancient people thought about it. So, in other words, yeah, all sorts of difficult things happen that from our very earthly perspective, they're not fair, they're not just, they're not beautiful. But if one trains oneself spiritually through philosophy, through meditation, through reflection, one is able to see the balance, the harmony, the beauty in the karmic balancing that's always happening. So Saturn reflects that, not just this kind of punitive, hard, but it's like you said earlier, Stormie, like if you develop a relationship with Saturn, Saturn will walk with you and you will see the beauty in the karmic balancing that's happening in your life all the time. If you're not living a life that's, let's just say, reflective in nature, it's a lot harder to see it. And Saturn does, in fact, end up feeling like he's kind of dragging you along.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and then the exaltation, I think, too, in Libra speaks so much too, because he's got this being known for the foundation. If our foundations are out of balance, if we are in our harvest keeping more than we give away, or vice versa, that lacks the principle of beauty, fairness, and justice. And so it's literally like an unbalanced foundation. So we see that, I think, as it speaks to it here as well. So it's a lovely time in the season right now to be considering that for sure.
Perfect. Yeah. Yeah. That's really nicely said. Interestingly, in Indian astrology, this is one of my favorite significations of Saturn that people don't know about often. In Indian astrology, Saturn was associated with outcasts. In ancient Greek, the word melas, at the root of melancholy, which is associated with Saturn, also meant dark, black, or a person of dark or black color or disposition. And that could mean a lot of different things, but Saturn has this traditional meaning of being associated with people who are marginalized, with people who are treated poorly, with people who are poor, impoverished, living on the outskirts of either normalcy, or of that they don't have wealth or money or status in society. So basically, you're kind of, Saturn also represents, you could say, the black sheep, the outcast, or the person also, when we talk about temperament or disposition, that's sort of downcast. Like in my high school, I remember in my high school when maybe this was for you too, Stormy, but like when goth first became a thing, it was like, I think Marilyn Manson was sort of a big deal or whatever, but
Oh yeah.
People started dressing differently all of a sudden. And that was probably like, I don't know, late junior high or high school for me when people started like really dressing differently. And there was a lot of different things too, like alternative rock. And so it's not just goth, but when someone starts showing, I don't care what you think. I'm going to be intentionally different or outside the margins or outside of the status quo. That kind of I reject the status quo. That would be associated with Saturn.
Yeah.
As well as, interestingly, because Saturn is the gatekeeper between the visible realm and the invisible realm, Saturn was thus associated with both the establishment as well as those that were despised or ostracized by the establishment. So that's what's so interesting about Saturn, is that Saturn could represent the military industrial complex, and Saturn could represent the hippie holding out the flower to the gun in the 60s.
Sure.
Because Saturn is not the planet. People always say Saturn is the planet of structure. And really, it's not the best word for Saturn, although I get it. Saturn is really a planet that's about boundaries, and not just let's just have a boundary to have a boundary. It's about how boundaries tend to polarize or divide things. And sometimes that's creative and really good, and sometimes it can be really oppressive. So for example, in ancient astrology, the way that aspects were conceptualized, you have the sun and the moon opposite the signs of Saturn. The sun is opposite in Leo to Aquarius, Saturn sign, and the moon in Cancer is opposite to Capricorn, Saturn sign. And the aspects from one sign to the other are the opposition. And so because Saturn rules the signs opposite the lights, Saturn became the planet associated with opposition itself. The oppositional or polarization between one thing and another. Saturn is not just, I oppose things. Saturn represents the tendency for things to get separated and for there to be some sense of like, well, build that wall, keep the immigrants out, or on the other hand, there is the sense of resist the man, like, remember there's this movie when I was a kid called Empire Records. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Damn the man,
Damn the man.
So that's Saturn. So Saturn can represent a criminal, a heretic, or a miser. So with the criminal, you have someone who says, I don't care about the rules. I'm going to live in opposition to the rules. A heretic is sort of like that, but they oftentimes are very progressive, like Galileo is the Catholic Church. Or Martin Luther was the Protestant Reformation. But you can also have a miser, someone who's very greedy, who doesn't want, like Ebenezer Scrooge on his gravestone. He's I believe he's a Capricorn in the book. But the point is that you could have someone experiencing Saturn from a wide variety of standpoints, because it encapsulates more than just tradition and rules. It's about how you polarize between something established and something contrary to what's established. Saturn can represent a black sheep, a wise hermit or recluse who's distanced themselves from the world intentionally, someone who doesn't fit in, that's ostracized, an introvert, or a sectarian of some kind, meaning it's this particular way of doing things and I live apart from the secular world because I'm deeply religious. Or can also represent, interestingly enough, cults. Saturn can be associated with people who are like, only this group, everything outside of this group is dangerous to you. So Saturn was also said to be the ruler of feigned appearances, and was the natural planetary contrary of the sun in Leo, the opposite sign, who it shares a secret affinity with. So this is really interesting because, when we go out into the day world, you go to your job and you put on a face. And when you come home at night, oftentimes you take off that face and you become who you really are. So there's this interesting juxtaposition between the sun and Saturn where because the two are like two sides of the same coin in the ancient esotericism, what appears to us to be something true, light, beautiful, natural, attractive, like that, oftentimes there will be this duplicitous other side to it. And that goes back to Saturn as being a planet that's associated with oppositions, but there's secret oppositions that Saturn rules as well. So for example, if you ever saw the movie I guess it was a TV show, House of Cards, did you ever see that?
Yeah. Oh,
All
yeah.
right. That show is so Saturnine, but it also encapsulates the ancient planetary contrariety between Saturn and the Sun. Here's Kevin Spacey and I think his wife was Robin Wright Penn. I think that's her name. Anyway, so they're like, we're benevolent, philanthropic, people, and then behind the scenes they're super, super cutthroat. So that sense of there being a feigned appearance to something, of being very postured or poised like a senator or whatever, but then being duplicitous on the other side, that was something Saturn was associated with. And so Saturn had this association with duplicity and deception as well. In mythology, of course, Saturn ruled the Golden Age, but eventually was cast out from his throne and usurped by his son Zeus. So there are all of these very interesting associations with Saturn and the Golden Age. So Saturn can represent, for example, this sense of everything being sort of perfect at some point in the past. And then at some point, that established order, harmony, beauty sort of gets overthrown. And this is from Saturn's perspective, of course. And then you end up longing to get back to a past that was taken from you or usurped. So for example, there couldn't be a more Saturnine political slogan, whether you agree with it or not. I'm certainly no fan of it, but whether you agree with it or not, make America great again. It might as well just say Kronos on the hat. Right? Because this idea that like once there was a golden age, right? And then it got overturned and we have to get back to it. Okay, but just to hold the left to hold the left to task as well, to take them to task, I should say. The left will often do the exact same thing, but for them, it's like, well, once upon a time, millions of years ago, there were these perfect, ideal goddess cultures that roamed the earth and everything was totally happy. And we've got to get back to that. I mean, or even think of the song at Woodstock, we've got to get back to the garden. So we're all capable of nostalgically looking to the past where, even in the United States, because I've been involved in the New Age culture for a long time now. And another thing that you often hear is like the noble, like, let's get back to like the noble indigenous time. It's like, well, don't forget that, like, and I'm just playing contrarian here, but don't forget that pretty much every indigenous culture around the earth has still had elements of, being barbaric or fighting or killing or, but anytime that we kind of nostalgize this ideal historic past, Atlantis or whatever it might be, make America great again, and we want to get back to it, that nostalgic longing for something lost is also associated with Saturn. And that can be a good thing too. I mean, seriously, there can be like, hey, look at how the Native Americans lived with the land. And can't we get back to that? Like that's not totally wrong. Or, sometimes you'll hear, like, I remember hearing my grandfather say things like, gosh, what's happened to the values of the youth or something like that. And I used to think to myself, what a fuddy-duddy or whatever. But now as a parent, when I see kids like with terrible posture and neck problems because they're staring down at their phones all the time, sometimes I think similar things,
Sure.
So we can all relate to that feeling of Saturn. There's also some interesting associations between Saturn and the Roman god Janus, which have to do with the Janus is a double-faced god that looks both backward and forward in time and can have this association with boundaries and thresholds between things. And that's another interesting association. Okay, so that takes us through all the traditional significations of Saturn. But I want to pause and see if we have any questions before I go forward.
No, not yet. We're doing all right.
Okay, cool. So the joy of Saturn, this is super interesting because this is where I'm going to start arguing that Saturn is just as mystical as Neptune. and maybe you'll disagree, but so Saturn was also said to rejoice in the 12th place, which was called the place of the evil spirit. Now, remember, in modern astrology, modern astrologers use sometimes what's called the 12-letter alphabet, which means that there will be an association between the first house and Aries and Mars, the second house and Taurus and Venus, the third house and Gemini and Mercury, like that around the wheel, which means Pisces gets associated with the 12th house. And therefore, because modern astrologers have also assigned Neptune as a kind of modern ruler of Pisces, you will see this association between Neptune and Pisces in the 12th. Well, interesting that in ancient astrology, Saturn was associated with the 12th in a system called the planetary joys. So, why was that? Well, the 12th was a place associated with the following themes: ostracization or abandonment, loss and grief. This could include orphans, for example, or people who are, like given away at birth or something like that. Exile and imprisonment, disease, sickness, and slavery, confusion and deception, insanity and sorcery, confinement and shipwreck, impermanence generally. Now, you have to remember that all of these themes for ancient astrologers, like Saturn, would have it. Of course, these themes can, and they can be vital, or they're often vital to spiritual awakening. So it's not that these themes are bad necessarily, because ancient astrologers, for this, this house though was certainly associated with Saturnine experiences and Saturnine themes and topics, all of which could be depending on what planets rule that place, where they are in the chart, and a lot of other factors, could be the picture of someone who, has difficult experiences that become paramount to their spiritual life and their spiritual development. They could also depict people who work with people who are sick, or work in hospitals, or who are healers, and so forth. But this was a very difficult house associated with Saturnine themes. Now, the 12th house was specifically seen in relation to the native's loss of control, because the 12th house was understood as having recently fallen away from the helm or the rising place, the first house, by means of the primary motion. Let me explain that a little bit. So you imagine that right before you were born, maybe minutes, maybe an hour, the most recent thing that happened was the 12th house was the first whole sign house. And then because the earth keeps rotating on its axis, the 12th, or the first sign, moves up and becomes the 12th sign. So that was because the first sign, the first whole sign house in ancient astrology, was associated with the native, their health and their agency, their autonomy, their sovereignty, in a sense. When that house slips away from the eastern horizon, meaning that sign slips away from the eastern horizon and rises up into the 12th position, it was sort of understood as a house that signified the loss of control, something being taken away from you. It's sort of like falling asleep at the wheel, which is why the house is associated with shipwreck, whereas the first house was associated with the helm, or the steering wheel of the ship. So the 12th house has this meaning of like where there's a loss of control. And the loss of control was associated with evil spirits or bad energies or whatever. But you have to remember that for ancient people, it's not like God versus the devil evil. It's all divine, right? So the evil spirit would just be like a subjectively unpleasing, dissatisfying, or challenging energy or element that comes into your life and may take away a sense of sovereignty, or control, but ultimately is a part of, remember, the daimon, the evil daimon, this is a part of a cosmology that includes spirit guides, and that your life is sort of being guided along perfectly, even if there's times, which I think we can all relate to, where you lose control. The 12th house was also associated with the labor pains of women. For example, when women are giving birth and they've not yet given birth, but they're laboring, associated with the 12th. So that's that kind of contractive, heavy feeling to it. The 12th house was also called metacosmios, which means a world in between worlds. It's a liminal space, oftentimes a space of confusion or uncertainty, also associated with people traveling in foreign lands that they aren't used to. and things like that. So all of those places that were in between or that were labor intensive, where you don't feel like you're totally in control, or it's just like a difficult interlude that you're going through in life, that was all associated with Saturn. Interestingly, in modern astrology, the 12th house has come to be associated with mysticism, ego loss, and karma, as well as the planet Neptune. So I think it's really funny that Neptune has sort of picked up on some of the themes that Saturn traditionally held.
Mm.
And that's what I want to close with. And then we can just open up for some discussion. So interestingly, I think this is my little hypothesis, but I think that Saturn is so actually, I think Saturn and Neptune have a lot in common. Look at how Saturn is implicated in aspectual relationships with all of the outer planets in their discovery charts. When Uranus is discovered, it's in a very tight opposition with Saturn. When Neptune is discovered, it's in a very tight conjunction with Saturn. And when Pluto is discovered, it's also in an opposition with Saturn. So you can see that there's something, it's really interesting the way that all of these outer planets in their discovery charts have this tight relationship with Saturn, and they oftentimes are pitted against Saturn, as though, here's the threshold Saturn of the old, and then there's this new thing over here. And as we've learned today, that dynamic speaks to Saturn's very nature. So in the discovery chart of Neptune, Saturn was closely conjoined with Neptune when it was discovered. Is it possible that these two planets, of all the outers, are the most intimately alike one another? And I think it is. Now I'm not going to say they're identical, because Neptune has some big differences, I think we could say as well. But consider the following similarities. Neptune is associated with the dissolving of boundaries, as well as all that is transcendental, mystical, and otherworldly. Well, Saturn was associated with disillusionment, death, winter, disintegration, as well as mystics and contemplatives who saw through the hollowness or emptiness of the world. Neptune is associated with delusions, dreams, intoxication, and madness. Saturn was associated with melancholy, which is basically the ancient word for all of that. Neptune is associated with water and confusion in the ocean. Saturn was associated with water and the darkness of ignorance. Neptune dissolves that which is permanent. Saturn was associated with old age and decay. So to be fair, they're not identical, but it seems to me more than a coincidence that Neptune came to be associated with the traditional house of Saturn. The 12th house was discovered in a conjunction with Saturn and also carries a lot of similar significations. I think that's important because we have to be careful that we're not unconsciously caught up in Saturn in the way that we think of the outer planets in relation to Saturn. As soon as we say, oh, well, there was this old astrology, and now there's this better astrology associated with the outer planets versus old Saturn, we're actually defining the outer planets in an incredibly Saturnine way unconsciously. And we don't want to do that, because Saturn can have a relationship with these planets and the outer planets with the traditional planets that doesn't have to be polarized. We don't have to see everything through the lens of Saturn. And yet we're sort of almost like deceived or tricked into doing so in the early modern period of astrology. We astrologers are, in the way that we end up categorizing these things. So that's kind of my final thing for you to think about. So I want you to hopefully take away from this talk the following designations that you'll consider about Saturn when you look at it. It's a mystical and contemplative planet. It's wise and it's deep. It's a fair and just planet. It's imaginative and often misunderstood as a planet, and also in terms of who and what it signifies. It signifies literally the misunderstood, the outcasts and the outsiders, the status quo versus those who stand outside of it. All of that is Saturnine. And it is a planet that is deep and comfortable with death and decay, not just a planet that symbolizes difficult endings. So remember that everything in the birth chart is also karma. For ancient astrologers, there was no planet or house that had the market cornered on karma. Every single planet, every single house, every single aspect is karmic, because this material world itself, the law of the material world, was said to be the law of karma. So there's no planet that has the market cornered on karma, because it's important to remember that, just so that you don't kind of project too much onto Saturn, which I think makes it difficult to know Saturn. It's like if you go out on a date with someone and they're really, let's say they're very beautiful to you and you find that really appealing or really intimidating or something like that, and that's all you can think about. Well, you're going to have a hard time getting to know that person because you're just only seeing one dimension of them. So yes, Saturn is something of the karmic judge, has that quality. But remember that all of the planets collectively are speaking to our karma. And remember that the foundation of most mystical traditions is the reality of impermanence and suffering. So without that Saturnine understanding, the path of spiritual life, including all of its imaginative, uplifting, beautiful qualities, can't be created or sustained. The ultimate meaning, in other words, of an opposition, which Saturn rules, is to find a way of holding the tension between, hey, everything's impermanent and being washed away all the time, and yet life is beautiful and worth living. We can hold that tension. We're holding the inherent tension between Saturn and the signs opposite Saturn, which were the signs of the lights. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this. That was record speed for me in getting through this because I know we didn't have all the time in the world, but there we are.
And I think it went off just fine. I think we made it through it beautifully. And all of the details are here for people to find you, contact you, interact with you. We've got several of your students actually in the chat box right now who are giving you massive amounts of thumbs up and saying that your classes are great. So that's always
thank you guys.
Super beautiful to see that happen.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me. This was really fun. Do we have any questions or any comments or reflections that people want to offer?
I know that there are a couple questions that people have in general, and I just want to offer this to you as well. I loved your talk. Thank you so much, because I have a talk about Saturn as the instigator of faith. So in your alignment with Saturn and Neptune, I absolutely love it. And I feel like this is coming more into consciousness, that Saturn's not just the bad, heavy foundational guy over here, that maybe actually there is like a cosmic conspiracy to actually help us do what we're doing here. Right?
I love that.
To produce something else. So absolutely. I absolutely love that. Now, we do have a question about when Saturn, just as general, when Saturn is retrograde in your chart, where does that take us?
Right. So, well, there's lots of ways of reading retrogrades. So I'm going to speak to kind of the Hellenistic mode of reading retrogrades, the kind of classical ancient mode. And retrogrades mean reversals. Now, a reversal is a pretty broad symbol, or has a pretty broad meaning. So you have to look at, what is Saturn representing in your chart? For example, if Saturn is retrograde and rules your 10th house, if you have Aquarius or Capricorn in your 10th, and Saturn is retrograde ruling that house, depending on which house Saturn is actually located in, you can experience a very significant reversal of fate, fortune, or circumstance relative to your career at some point in your life, and sometimes multiple times in your life, depending on whether Saturn is in a cardinal, fixed, or mutable sign. But transits to that Saturn will often indicate significant turning points where you've been going in one direction and suddenly you turn and go in a slightly different direction, or reversals happen where it's like, oh, I was heading off to be this kind of professional, but then I decided, no, I really want to do this other thing. Sometimes the reversals are more unfortunate, and difficult, like ruling your 7th Saturn retrograde sometimes is going to mean that there's at least 1 or 2 relationships that don't work out because there's this quality of reversal of direction or fortune or circumstance. So that's not always the case, of course, but you just think about all the different ways in which the fortune of a topic in the chart that's ruled by Saturn could end up reversing or shifting course in some way. And typically transits to the Saturn, important transits like your Saturn return and so forth, will bring those reversals about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something I think about too, just looking at, like where Saturn's at in the chart. Is he's the significator of what house? And you can see it there and spot it. But I also tend to find when I see Saturn retrograde in a chart, part of the lesson is to overcome the inferiority complex that seems to be sitting there in some way, So I think a lot about, I love to study Marilyn Monroe's chart. that is such a brilliant example. She's got Saturn retrograde deep in the chart in the 4th house in Scorpio. And it tells a lot of the story as you weigh it against even the hemisphere theme that she's got going. And you can get a whole picture in about 15 minutes considering it in that direction. So that's something we can definitely consider. But also there, though, that if you do have Saturn in the 12th house, it's not the end of the world. Like no planet in any placement is the end of the world.
Oh, right.
Right?
Yeah.
There is simply work. And if we come from the mystical tradition of the joys, Saturn is in the joy in the 12th house because there's change and healing that comes when you walk in a space that's in between the worlds,
Mhm.
you know? So
Yeah, that Saturn, any planet that, is in its own joy, it's like having dignity. It would be like Saturn in Capricorn or Aquarius in a sense, where it feels really comfortable in that place. And you usually see, more of the more comfortable, easier. I don't want to say there's no difficulty, but you kind of see, like I have a student, for example, with Saturn in the 12th who's lived off the grid most of her adult life, and she loves it. Saturn in the 12th. And speaking to what you said about Marilyn Monroe's chart, just to kind of link it, because that's such a nice psychological interpretation where in overcoming inferiority, I love that one. And if you can apply them both at once too, like Saturn being retrograde in the 4th house in Monroe's case, ruling her 7th by whole sign anyway, in Aquarius, she had all of these multiple reversals in her life around her home and living environment and around marriages, and the two were connected since the time she was young. Like she had a dad who wasn't there. She was shuffled around through the foster care system or the state care, or like maybe she even lived in like a home at some point, and her mom was not well, and so she had all of these major reversals early on, with her home environment. And even I think it was her first marriage at like 16 was to get her out of the state foster care system. She married someone. And then that becomes this theme in her life of like learning how to become more resilient and independent and like kind of finding her way in the world. Do you resonate with that?
yeah, absolutely. And I do think about it a lot, just truly against the fact that she's got such a heavy southern hemisphere. It's that development of the world does not decide my value. I've got to find a place to anchor and how to kind of overcome that. And, in connection with your talk, her Saturn squares that Neptune.
Right. Yeah, that's huge. I think it
Yeah.
squares her moon and Jupiter too, right?
Yeah,
It's like
it
the
sure
whole
does.
sign square, but yeah,
It does.
I've done that chart before in class, so I remember it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then it acts as like, that the big apex of that chart is like the bullet shoots through that Saturn, which is like, okay, we've got to overcome in this anchoring point, whatever the less than is, and kind of
Hmm.
grab it and come to the other side of that, which I always think is interesting too, because her nodes, this is so far off topic, but her nodes are at 18 degrees, like really in the 12th house in Cancer. To me, that also speaks to it. Like we've got to outgrow our past. We've got to nurture a different future. If we're going to have it, I got to go to ground with my emotions. And at 18 is when things really started kicking off in the public life for her.
Interesting. Yeah, I think too about her mom and her mom's mental health problems and the way that that was such a pivotal part of her kind of individuating.
Yeah.
And that idea of Rahu in the Indian tradition being in Cancer, the sign of the moon and mother in the 12th, the joy of Saturn. It makes such perfect sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So we could just go through that whole chart in a whole
Right.
nother episode, right?
Yeah,
But
right.
yes, you can definitely see how that retrograde Saturn plays a pretty rooting place in that chart.
For sure. Yeah, and that's a retrograde Saturn, you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
Speaking to that question. Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah, retrograde Saturn in Scorpio in the 4th. I'm like, well, we've got a whole story just to start right there. I
Mhm.
think, yeah, good. Well, I don't think we have any other big questions right now, and I know you have big work to do today. So
Yeah, I'm working right now on a lot of different things. Is it okay if I plug what I've got coming up?
absolutely, my gosh, yeah.
Thank you. Well, really cool. The first thing I'll say is, and let me just see if I can actually put this up on the screen so that you guys can just see it on my website, because that's going to be the easiest. Yeah, I can do that. So, um, let's see. We're all like Zoom proficient these days.
I know, I know, my gosh, you're going to catch us in 2026 and we're going to be firing with this thing.
Right. So here's my website, nightlightastrology.com. One of the things coming up that's really cool is if you go to my speaker series under events, you're going to find that we have a really cool speaker series coming up October 3rd, 10th, and 17th, including Stormie, who's giving a talk on astrology and social media on October 17th. So we will be switching positions and having you come and give all of my students a talk really shortly. I think that's going to be really fun.
Yeah.
But these talks are free. You can register for them. If you can't make it live to the webinar, you have a week to watch the replay. So that's something coming up that you might all find interesting. Obviously, I've got readings that I offer. Because I'm a practitioner of Bhakti Yoga, if you're interested in Bhakti Yoga, I have a whole private channel full of Bhakti Yoga content that's free. And then I have a YouTube channel, which I think was advertised on the other I had it up, but it's just, you can just look for me at Nightlight Astrology on YouTube. And if you want to follow my own kind of daily video blogs. And then the big thing is my course, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic, which is a 1-year course in Hellenistic astrology, starts in mid-November. Filling up pretty good at a good rate right now, but there's still time to sign up. There's 30 classes on the year, bunch of guest lectures. Stormie's one of our guest lecturers for the year. There's an opportunity to learn ancient astrology and then see it put into practice with live clients, which I think is really valuable experience. So if that's interesting to you, you can check it out. We have need-based tuition for people who are struggling at all, especially due to COVID. There's an early bird rate and stuff like that. So I think that's what I've got.
Yeah, no, that's, you're like just a whole presentation and you're like, oh, I just have this little dish for you.
Right. So
awesome. Well, I hope that this has been a time that was absolutely worth showing up for. I think it was. I absolutely enjoyed it. If you're watching back on the replay, feel free to leave comments down below and we'll come through and answer them if there are some questions that you have we didn't get to live. And so thank you again, Acyuta-Bhava, for coming over. And I look forward to seeing you soon. We're going to see each other really soon.
Yeah, we are. And tell everyone, if they want a copy of the PDF with the slides, they can email me info@nightlightastrology.com, and I'm happy to share them with you if you want those notes.
Look at that. And swag. You can definitely come back.
Cool.
All right, you guys, we will see you later this afternoon when we have Gemini Brett over at 2 p.m. Mountain Time. And we're going to talk about when do the energies shift? When are things going to perceptively get better? So we'll be talking about that this afternoon. And we'll see you guys on the next Eat and Greet. Bye, everybody.